The Mongolian steppe did not announce itself with monuments or borders. It stretched outward in all directions, flat and exposed, broken only by distant ridgelines and the slow movement of clouds that offered little promise of rain. Wind moved constantly across the grasslands, carrying dust, scent, and warning. In this environment, nothing remained hidden for long, and nothing remained secure without effort. Survival depended on motion, on reading subtle changes in weather and behavior, on understanding when to advance and when to vanish. This was not a land that rewarded permanence. It favored those who adapted quickly and punished hesitation with equal indifference. Life on the steppe demanded loyalty, but it could not rely on trust. Alliances formed out of necessity rather than sentiment, and they dissolved just as easily when circumstances shifted. Families traveled together not because tradition required it, but because isolation invited extinction. Authority existed only so long as it could protect and provide. When it failed, it was abandoned without ceremony. Memory lingered longer than mercy. Grievances were preserved across seasons, carried forward as lessons rather than emotions. Violence was not celebrated, but it was understood as a tool, one that could not be avoided and could not be wasted. Temujin was born into this uncertainty, not as an heir to stability, but as a child of its absence. His early years were marked by abrupt loss and forced adaptation. When his father was poisoned and his family cast aside, the steppe did not soften its demands. Food had to be found, shelter secured, rivals avoided or confronted. Each decision carried immediate consequence. The environment allowed no separation between childhood and endurance. Hunger was not metaphorical. Cold was not symbolic. They shaped behavior directly, pressing themselves into the body and determining what could be afforded emotionally and physically. Without institutional protection, survival became an exercise in calculation. Who could be trusted for a season and who posed a threat tomorrow? Which paths offered grazing and which exposed travelers to ambush? The steppe taught that permanence was illusion and preparation essential. Temujin learned early that strength alone did not ensure survival. Strength attracted attention. What mattered was reliability, the capacity to endure scarcity without fragmenting, to remember obligation when circumstances changed. These lessons were not philosophical. They were learned through repetition, reinforced by loss. Authority on the steppe was provisional. Leaders emerged through demonstrated competence rather than inherited right, and their authority required constant reinforcement. A single failure could undo years of dominance. This instability bred vigilance. Camps were arranged defensively. Movements were deliberate. Even moments of rest carried awareness. The sound of hooves at a distance could signal trade or attack, and the difference was often unclear until too late. Such uncertainty trained attention outward and discouraged indulgence in expectation. Temujin observed these patterns long before he shaped them. He watched alliances collapse under strain and noted which leaders retained followers through hardship. The steppe revealed that loyalty followed consistency more than generosity. Men endured deprivation when rules remained clear and rewards predictable. Arbitrary authority dissolved quickly, its followers scattering in search of alternatives. These observations accumulated quietly, forming a framework long before it was articulated. Scarcity sharpened perception. Every object held potential value. A horse represented mobility, status, and survival. Its loss narrowed the future. Clothing bore the marks of use, repaired repeatedly, carrying history in its seams. Movement was constant, yet constrained by the need to protect what little could be carried. This physical reality disciplined ambition. Grand gestures had no place here. Excess exposed vulnerability. The psychological impact of such an environment was cumulative. Fear did not arrive as panic, but as steady awareness. It shaped posture, sleep, and speech. Decisions were made with an understanding that mistakes echoed. Temujin's early experiences impressed upon him that survival required more than courage. It required foresight and restraint, an ability to absorb hardship without allowing it to fracture resolve. Anger could be indulged only when it served purpose. The steppe also enforced equality through exposure. Weather affected all equally, stripping hierarchy of comfort. Leaders endured the same cold and hunger as their followers. Authority that insulated itself from shared hardship lost legitimacy quickly. This proximity reinforced accountability. Decisions were visible in their outcomes. There was little room for abstraction. Success and failure were experienced collectively. In this context, memory became currency. Stories preserved lessons and warned against repetition. Betrayals were recalled precisely, not to inflame but to inform. Temujin absorbed this culture of remembrance, understanding that forgetting invited repetition. Yet memory also offered continuity. It connected individuals to a lineage of survival, framing endurance as inheritance rather than accident. The steppe demanded systemic thinking long before systems existed. Patterns governed movement, resource use, and conflict. Those who recognized and adapted to these patterns endured. Those who relied on impulse did not. Temujin's formative years were spent observing these dynamics without control over them. This position cultivated patience. He learned to wait, to endure marginalization without losing focus, to assess before acting. The land offered no illusion of protection. Exposure was constant, and with it responsibility. Survival could not be delegated. Each member of a group bore consequence for collective failure. This distributed accountability reinforced cohesion when properly managed. Temujin saw how effective leaders aligned individual survival with group stability, ensuring that personal interest reinforced collective order. By the time Temujin began to assert himself, the steppe had already shaped his assumptions. He did not imagine authority as permanent or unconditional. He understood that power required structure to outlast circumstance. The environment had demonstrated repeatedly that strength without organization dissipated, and loyalty without clarity eroded. The stakes were implicit rather than declared. In a world without institutions, survival itself became strategy. Every decision carried weight beyond the immediate moment, influencing perception and future alignment. The steppe tolerated no indulgence in abstraction. It rewarded those who could impose order upon uncertainty without denying its presence. This landscape did not produce conquerors by chance. Produced systems through necessity. Any leader who survived it long enough to matter learned to think beyond individual triumph. Endurance required mechanisms that functioned regardless of personality. The steppe ensured that only those capable of such thinking remained. On the Mongolian steppe, authority did not accumulate. It evaporated. Leadership was asserted through presence and proven through constant success, but it rested on no durable foundation. A leader's strength existed only in the present tense. Past victories offered reputation, not protection. The moment weakness appeared, through loss, hesitation, or miscalculation, followers recalculated their interests. Loyalty shifted quietly, often before collapse was visible. This instability was not moral failure but structural reality. In a world without institutions, power depended entirely on uninterrupted performance. Traditional conquest models assumed permanence where none existed. Seizing territory meant little on land that could not be enclosed. Defeating rivals mattered only until the next season, when alliances reconfigured and displaced enemies returned as partners to someone else. Leadership required constant motion, constant negotiation, constant vigilance. Any pause invited erosion. Authority on the steppe was less a position than a balancing act, sustained only by momentum. Temujin encountered this reality repeatedly in his early attempts to assert himself. When he gathered followers, they came cautiously, testing his capacity to provide food, protection, and advantage. Their loyalty was conditional and openly so. Promises were weighed against immediate conditions. When hardship intensified, some drifted away without explanation. Others defected deliberately, aligning with stronger figures or returning to kin networks. These departures were not betrayals in the moral sense. They were rational responses to an environment where survival outweighed allegiance. Charisma alone proved insufficient. A leader could inspire confidence briefly, but inspiration faded when resources thinned or danger increased. Brute force offered temporary compliance, but coercion demanded constant enforcement. The energy required to maintain dominance through fear exhausted leaders quickly, leaving them vulnerable. Temujin observed that those who ruled through intimidation attracted resistance proportionate to their severity. Violence bred vigilance, and vigilance drained cohesion. Even success carried risk. Victories created visibility, drawing attention from rivals who sought to test or undermine emerging power. The step rewarded neither modesty nor excess, but it punished imbalance relentlessly. Leaders who expanded too rapidly outpaced their capacity to sustain followers. Those who hesitated lost initiative. Temujin's early failures reflected these constraints. Each setback reinforced the limits of personal authority unanchored by structure. Betrayal was common because incentives favored it. Loyalty offered no guaranteed return. Followers calculated continuously, assessing whether remaining aligned improved their prospects. When it did not, departure was logical. Temujin learned not to interpret such behavior as exceptional. It was the expected outcome of a system that offered no long-term security. The absence of enduring obligation ensured constant flux. This instability extended beyond individuals to entire coalitions. Alliances formed through marriage, shared campaigns, or mutual threats, but they lacked permanence. Once objectives shifted, cohesion dissolved. Leaders who relied on kinship alone found it insufficient to restrain ambition. Blood ties mitigated conflict but did not eliminate it. Temujin witnessed relatives align against one another when advantage beckoned elsewhere. The step treated lineage as resource, not guarantee. Violence saturated this landscape, yet it did not produce unity. Conflict resolved immediate disputes but created new grievances. Each victory planted the seeds of future opposition. Without mechanisms to integrate the defeated, conquest merely reshuffled antagonists. Temujin observed that dominance achieved through force alone required constant repetition. Every campaign had to be reinforced, every victory defended anew. This cycle consumed attention and energy without delivering stability. The psychological toll of such leadership was significant. Constant vigilance eroded trust. Leaders slept lightly, anticipating defection as much as attack. Decisions were made under pressure, often with incomplete information. Temujin experienced the strain of this environment personally. Moments of confidence were brief, interrupted by reminders of fragility. The step offered no refuge from uncertainty. Yet within this instability, patterns emerged. Leaders who endured longest did so by minimizing unpredictability within their own ranks. They enforced clear expectations and consistent consequences. Followers tolerated hardship when rules remained legible. Arbitrary behavior provoked withdrawal. Temujin began to recognize that the problem was not violence itself, but the absence of continuity. Force could compel action, but it could not sustain alignment without predictable structure. The prevailing order encouraged fragmentation. Every individual remained a potential rival, every group a temporary configuration. Authority existed as long as it was constantly reaffirmed. This environment favored short-term gains over long-term planning. Temujin's early struggles exposed the inadequacy of this model. Even when he succeeded militarily, he found his position precarious. Dominance without durability offered no resolution. He began to understand that unification required more than defeating rivals. It demanded reconfiguration of incentives. Loyalty needed reinforcement beyond immediate reward. The step's existing norms offered no such mechanisms. Leadership was personal and therefore fragile. Temujin's experiences revealed that replacing one dominant figure with another would not alter this dynamic. The cycle would persist, consuming successive leaders. This realization complicated his path forward. Ambition alone could not resolve the underlying instability. The step did not lack strength. It lacked cohesion. Temujin recognized that imposing order required redesigning authority itself. Power needed to extend beyond individual presence, embedding itself in practices that endured absence and loss. The recognition was gradual, shaped by repeated failure rather than revelation. Each collapsed alliance, each deserted camp reinforced the lesson. Temujin absorbed these outcomes without indulging resentment. He treated them as data, evidence of systemic limits. The steppe rewarded such restraint. Those who learned from loss endured longer than those who sought immediate retribution. By this stage, Temujin understood that conquest alone could never unify the Mongols. Violence existed in abundance, but loyalty did not endure. Authority dissolved with weakness because it relied on personality rather than structure. To overcome this, dominance would need redesign. The problem was not how to seize power, but how to make it persist. Temujin's transformation did not announce itself through spectacle. It emerged quietly, through alterations in how men were counted, fed, punished, and rewarded. The steppe remained harsh and indifferent, but the internal logic of his following began to change. Where lineage once determined proximity to power, function now intervened. Men were assessed not by ancestry or reputation, but by reliability under pressure. Those who arrived when ordered, who guarded supplies without complaint, who returned from patrol with accurate reports found themselves elevated. Those who faltered, regardless of name or kinship, found themselves stalled or removed. This shift was not framed as reform. It was implemented through repetition until it became normal. The physical arrangement of his camps reflected this recalibration. Tents were positioned according to units rather than families. Supplies were counted centrally, redistributed methodically, and audited through trust earned rather than inherited. Horses were assigned based on need, not ownership, and reclaimed when misused. These changes reduced friction quietly. Men learned where they stood without constant negotiation. Predictability replaced improvisation. The constant anxiety of favor and favoritism began to recede, replaced by the simpler pressure of performance. Violence, long the primary currency of authority, was not abandoned. It was constrained. Punishment became standardized, its conditions understood in advance. Theft, desertion, and disobedience carried known consequences, applied without visible anger. Executions occurred without ceremony, carried out efficiently and without embellishment. This restraint altered their impact. Fear no longer spiked unpredictably. It settled into expectation. Men did not wonder if punishment would come, only whether their actions warranted it. This clarity reduced impulsive behavior more effectively than terror ever had. Temujin's own behavior reinforced this discipline. He resisted intervention driven by personal grievance. When disputes arose, they were judged against established norms rather than favor. Even those close to him were not exempt. This consistency surprised followers accustomed to personal rule. It also unsettled rivals, who found fewer opportunities to exploit internal resentment. Authority no longer radiated solely from Temujin's presence. It resided in process. The reorganization of military units marked a decisive escalation. Men were grouped into standardized formations, each responsible for the behavior of its members. Collective accountability replaced individual indulgence. Success and failure were shared, incentivizing internal discipline. Units began to operate interchangeably, responding to commands with uniform precision. This homogeneity reduced reliance on exceptional individuals. When leaders fell, formations persisted. The system absorbed loss without collapsing. Psychologically, this transition demanded adjustment. Warriors accustomed to measuring worth through personal valor confronted a new metric: consistency. Glory became secondary to reliability. Some resisted quietly, others openly. Those who could not adapt were marginalized or removed. Temujin did not pursue them with resentment. Their departure reinforced the system's boundaries. What remained grew more coherent. The emotional texture of this phase was subdued. There were no grand declarations, no visible rupture with tradition. Change unfolded through routine. Orders were issued calmly, enforced steadily, and reviewed without drama. This absence of spectacle masked the magnitude of transformation. A society organized around personal allegiance was being replaced by one governed through expectation. Campaigns conducted under this new structure revealed its advantages. Marches occurred with fewer delays. Supplies arrived where expected. Units maneuvered with coordination rather than improvisation. When losses occurred, replacements integrated smoothly. The battlefield ceased to be a theater of individual initiative and became an environment of controlled movement. Victory followed not from ferocity alone, but from coherence. Temujin observed these outcomes without indulgence. He understood that efficiency generated dependence. Men whose survival relied on system rather than patronage had fewer incentives to defect. Loyalty became conditional, but the conditions were clear and broadly attainable. This predictability reduced anxiety and fostered compliance. Fear remained present, but it was diffuse, attached to rules rather than moods. The system's impersonality proved its strength. Decisions could be anticipated, reducing the need for constant negotiation. Authority became legible. Rivals accustomed to exploiting personal rivalries found fewer seams to pry open. Attempts at subversion faltered against uniform enforcement. The cost of resistance increased, not through brutality, but through futility. As the structure matured, Temujin's role shifted subtly. He remained central but less singular. Commands issued in his name followed established patterns. His presence reinforced order, but its absence no longer guaranteed collapse. This diffusion of authority marked a critical escalation. Power began to outgrow the man who initiated it. Emotionally, this phase carried a different weight. The fear that once accompanied unpredictability gave way to the steadier pressure of expectation. Men understood what was required and what would follow failure. This clarity was exhausting but stabilizing. The constant recalculation that defined steppe politics diminished. Energy redirected toward execution rather than survival. Executions, when they occurred, exemplified this restraint. There were no speeches, no gestures toward spectacle. The condemned were removed efficiently, their absence noted, their position filled. Life continued. The lack of emotional display amplified the system's authority. Violence was no longer a performance. It was an administrative act. Over time, the system's logic began to reproduce itself. New recruits learned norms through observation rather than instruction. Discipline became habitual. Units corrected internal deviations before external enforcement was required. Authority embedded itself in behavior. Temujin's ambition, once necessary to drive momentum, became less visible. The structure now generated its own inertia. This escalation did not expand territory dramatically. It expanded capacity. The ability to mobilize, coordinate, and sustain action increased. Rivals encountered forces that behaved predictably, responded uniformly, and persisted beyond individual losses. The emotional impact of facing such an opponent lay not in terror, but in inevitability. By the chapter's close, the transformation was evident. Temujin had not merely gathered followers. He had engineered predictability. Power no longer relied on charisma alone. It functioned through rules that endured absence and absorbed failure. The system began to operate independently of personal ambition, marking the transition from man to mechanism. The expansion outward began without a change in tone. Camps still rose and fell with the wind, horses still grazed under watch, and men still moved through dust and cold as they always had. What changed was the certainty with which movement occurred. Campaigns were no longer reactions to opportunity alone. They were planned sequences, assembled through information gathered in advance and executed according to expectation. Scouts moved ahead not to provoke, but to measure. Messengers traveled established routes, carrying reports that fed into decisions made days earlier. War began to resemble routine labor, its violence stripped of spontaneity and folded into process. The physical burden of campaigning remained severe, but it was now distributed evenly. Loads were calculated, supplies rationed, and reserves positioned deliberately. Armies no longer depended on sudden plunder to sustain momentum. They arrived prepared, carried surplus, and withdrew when necessary without collapse. This discipline reduced exhaustion and limited disorder. Men slept when ordered, moved when commanded, and fought within defined parameters. The steppe's unpredictability persisted, but the response to it became standardized. Cities encountered this force as something unfamiliar. They expected raiders or besiegers driven by hunger or vengeance. Instead, they faced formations that paused, assessed, and negotiated with chilling clarity. Demands were presented plainly. Compliance brought incorporation. Resistance triggered methodical response. There was no rush, no emotional escalation. Siege works advanced steadily, cut lines tightened, and isolation deepened. The absence of spectacle unsettled defenders more than fury would have. The attackers behaved as though outcome were administrative, not contested. Violence, when deployed, followed pattern. Punishment targeted specific breaches, not generalized defiance. Entire populations were not slaughtered indiscriminately. They were sorted. Skilled artisans were removed, administrators retained, soldiers neutralized. This selectivity conveyed intent. The conquerors were not there to destroy the city's function, but to seize it intact. War ceased to be interruption and became transition. Intelligence underpinned every movement. Merchants, envoys, and defectors provided maps of loyalty and fracture. Information was verified through redundancy, not trust. False reports carried consequences. Accuracy became currency. This emphasis reshaped behavior even among civilians. Cooperation offered predictability. Deception invited scrutiny. Over time, the reputation of inevitability spread faster than armies themselves. Psychologically, this phase marked a shift for those executing orders. Warriors accustomed to immediate feedback now operated within longer horizons. Results were delayed, effects cumulative. Discipline demanded patience, restraint under provocation, and obedience to timing. These demands filtered personnel continuously. Those unable to conform fell away. Those who adapted found stability within motion. Genghis Khan's presence during these campaigns was less theatrical than expected. He moved among units, observed logistics, questioned reports, and corrected deviations. Decisions were issued quietly, enforced uniformly. His authority manifested through alignment rather than command volume. Subordinates anticipated expectations, reducing friction. War no longer required constant assertion. It unfolded through alignment of parts. Resistance collapsed not solely because of force, but because it lacked comparable coherence. Opponents mobilized courage and desperation, but their responses remained fragmented. Alliances formed late, fractured early, and struggled to coordinate. Against an enemy that behaved like governance in motion, improvisation proved insufficient. Each isolated stand weakened the whole. Collapse occurred unevenly, quietly, often before final engagement. The sensory experience of conquest reflected this control. Cities fell without the roar of mass panic. Streets emptied methodically. Gates opened under negotiation or pressure applied steadily. Silence followed surrender, broken by administrative orders rather than screams. The absence of chaos signaled permanence. Conquest did not announce itself as ending. It established itself as replacement. Internally, the system absorbed new territory without disruption. Local administrators were retained under supervision. Taxes were assessed consistently. Laws were communicated clearly. Punishment remained predictable. The same mechanisms that governed the steppe now extended outward, adjusted for scale but not principle. This continuity reinforced legitimacy. Rule felt imposed, but intelligible. Emotionally, this turning point carried a colder weight. Triumph was muted. There were no celebratory excesses, no indulgence in devastation. Success registered through reports filed, routes secured, resources cataloged. The system rewarded completion rather than glory. War's meaning shifted from expression of dominance to execution of order. Genghis Khan's role crystallized here. He ceased to be merely the most capable warrior among many. He became the coordinator of violence, the designer of outcomes that extended beyond the battlefield. His decisions shaped populations rather than moments. Authority flowed through him into structure, not through charisma alone. By the end of this phase, war had been transformed. It functioned as administration conducted under extreme conditions. Movement, punishment, and incorporation followed logic rather than impulse. Violence remained central, but it was harnessed, predictable, and purposeful. The empire expanded not as an eruption, but as a system advancing step by step. The turning point lay not in the scale of conquest, but in its character. War had become order in motion, and the world beyond the steppe began to feel its pressure accordingly. Control after conquest did not announce itself with banners or proclamations. It settled gradually, like dust after movement, visible only in its persistence. Garrisons were small, often understated, positioned not to intimidate but to observe. Authority traveled through messengers rather than armies, through written orders rather than personal presence. The conquered landscape did not feel occupied in the conventional sense. It felt monitored, catalogued, and quietly integrated into a larger pattern that operated regardless of local sentiment. Laws applied without regard for custom, yet they did not erase it. Local practices continued where they did not interfere with core requirements. Taxation, military obligation, obedience to central decree. Elites who recognized this early were preserved. They retained status under new terms, learning to function as intermediaries rather than rivals. Their survival depended on reliability, not heritage. Those who resisted outright were not pursued endlessly. They were isolated, deprived of support, and rendered irrelevant by systems that continued without them. Trade routes stabilized with remarkable speed. Banditry declined not because of constant patrols, but because punishment was certain and delayed rather than immediate. Merchants learned that compliance ensured protection across vast distances. Goods moved farther than before, carried by caravans that trusted schedules more than escorts. Markets adjusted. Prices normalized. The empire's presence manifested in predictability rather than force. Communication underpinned everything. Relay stations dotted the landscape, spaced deliberately to maximize speed without exhaustion. Riders changed horses, not direction. Messages arrived intact, unembellished, expected. Orders issued weeks earlier were enforced precisely, even in regions the ruler had never seen. This continuity of command created a sense of omnipresence that did not rely on visibility. People behaved as though watched, not because guards stood nearby, but because response was inevitable. Psychologically, fear evolved. Initial terror of invasion faded into calculation. Communities assessed risk not in terms of survival but of advantage. Rebellion remained possible, but its cost was clear and its benefit uncertain. There was no romance in defiance against a system that absorbed disruption and resumed function. Resistance required coordination, secrecy, and sustained commitment, all of which the empire's structure undermined through surveillance and incentive. The system's restraint was deliberate. Excessive punishment risked destabilization. Leniency risked erosion. Balance was maintained through consistency. When punishment occurred, it followed established pattern. When reward was granted, it was proportional and documented. This predictability reduced emotional volatility. Subjects learned to anticipate outcomes, and anticipation tempered impulse. Distance, once the enemy of control, became irrelevant. Authority did not thin with geography. It replicated. Local administrators mirrored central procedure, trained to value accuracy over initiative. Innovation was discouraged where it threatened coherence. Uniformity mattered more than brilliance. This choice limited adaptability in some contexts, but it preserved stability across diversity. Genghis Khan's role receded further into abstraction. He became less a figure encountered than a principle enforced. His name circulated through documents, oaths, and penalties. It did not need reinforcement through appearance. The system functioned without him, yet remained unmistakably his creation. Power survived separation from its source. Emotionally, the conquered world adjusted to inevitability. Anxiety gave way to routine. Children grew up under laws they had not witnessed imposed. Memory of resistance faded into cautionary tale rather than inspiration. The empire did not demand love or loyalty beyond obedience. It required participation. That requirement proved easier to meet than opposition. By the chapter's end, expansion no longer carried the expectation of collapse. The pattern had proven resilient. Authority held across cultures, climates, and generations. Control survived distance because it did not depend on presence. The empire endured not through constant assertion, but through systems that made alternatives costly and endurance ordinary. The system did not pause to mourn its architect. When Genghis Khan's presence began to recede, first through distance, then through age and finally through death, the machinery he had built showed no visible hesitation. Succession unfolded without the familiar signals of collapse that had defined steppe politics for generations. There was tension, but it was procedural rather than existential. Claims were weighed through established channels. Authority moved along paths that had already been cleared, reinforced by precedent rather than personality. What emerged was not harmony, but continuity, enforced by rules that limited the scope of ambition before it could destabilize the whole. This impersonality was not accidental. From its inception, the system had been designed to survive unreliable men. Loyalty was owed upward to structure, not sideways to kin or inward to ego. Even those who stood to inherit power found their choices narrowed by expectation. They were constrained by obligations they had not written and by surveillance they could not escape. Violence remained an option, but it was no longer decisive on its own. To act outside procedure was to invite unified response, swift and unambiguous. The cost of defiance now exceeded its potential reward. The emotional atmosphere of governance shifted accordingly. Where fear once centered on individual reprisal, it now diffused into awareness of inevitability. Officials operated with caution rather than zeal. Decisions were documented, relayed, confirmed. Silence in council chambers carried weight not because of intimidation, but because deviation was visible. The system absorbed dissent through process, turning personal grievance into administrative matter. Even punishment lost its theatrical edge. It was enacted efficiently, recorded precisely, and then folded back into routine. Genghis Khan's name persisted, but increasingly as reference rather than command. It appeared in law codes, in oaths of service, in the language used to justify consistency. His physical absence sharpened the distinction between founder and function. The empire no longer required his judgment to operate. In fact, his unpredictability, once a source of strength, would have disrupted the balance that had formed. The danger he once embodied, the concentration of unlimited authority in a single will, had been rendered obsolete by his own creation. Succession did not erase competition, but it reframed it. Aspirants maneuvered within boundaries, testing limits rather than breaking them outright. Their ambitions expressed themselves through alignment with policy, through control of institutions rather than open conflict. This containment preserved energy. Instead of consuming itself in civil war, the empire redirected internal pressure outward or downward into refinement and enforcement. Stability was not passive. It was maintained through constant calibration. The environment reflected this normalization. Roads remained open. Relay stations continued to function. Taxation proceeded without interruption. Local administrators adjusted to new names at the top without altering daily practice. For most subjects, the transition registered as an update rather than an upheaval. Life did not improve dramatically, but it did not regress. That continuity reinforced legitimacy more effectively than spectacle ever could. Psychologically, the ruling class adapted to diminished autonomy. Exceptional men learned restraint. Initiative survived only where it aligned with established goals. Innovation was tolerated when it improved efficiency, discouraged when it threatened coherence. Over time, this produced a leadership culture that valued predictability over brilliance. The system did not reward charisma. It rewarded compliance and competence. Those traits proved easier to replicate across generations. Violence, though still present, lost its central narrative role. It functioned as enforcement, not expression. The empire's strength lay in making force unnecessary most of the time. When applied, it was decisive precisely because it was rare. This restraint preserved resources and reduced volatility. It also signaled confidence. A system that does not need constant demonstration of power is one that expects obedience as default. By absorbing its architect into structure, the empire achieved a paradoxical safety. The figure who had once embodied instability through sheer capability was neutralized by permanence. Genghis Khan became a foundation rather than a variable. His legacy was embedded so thoroughly that it could no longer be contested without dismantling the entire order. A task too large for any single actor to attempt successfully. As years passed, stability ceased to feel provisional. It became routine. Children born after the great conquests knew the empire as given fact, not achievement. Memory of chaos receded into managed history. The system endured not because it inspired, but because it constrained effectively. In doing so, it outlived its creator, proving that the most enduring power he wielded was the one he designed to function without him. The memory that survives tends to favor what can be seen. Cities burned leave clearer traces than regulations enforced, and mass death imprints itself more readily than administrative continuity. Genghis Khan occupies this imbalance fully. The world remembers the smoke, the slaughter, the scale of conquest, because those elements were immediate, terrifying, and visible to those who endured them. Chroniclers counted bodies, listed fallen capitals, described fear as it moved faster than armies. Yet these records, accurate as they are in detail, obscure the deeper mechanism that made such destruction both repeatable and, eventually, unnecessary. What endured was not chaos, but a redefinition of how power operated once chaos had served its purpose. The Mongol campaigns did not rely on improvisation alone. Even at their most violent, they followed patterns that reduced uncertainty. Punishment was consistent. Surrender was incentivized. Resistance triggered response not because of personal rage, but because deviation threatened predictability. Over time, this created a grim clarity. Communities learned the cost of defiance and the relative safety of compliance. Violence became instructional rather than expressive. It communicated boundaries. Once those boundaries were understood, enforcement could recede. That retreat is what history tends to miss, because silence leaves fewer ruins than terror. The transformation lay in portability. Before him, power decayed with distance. Authority thinned as it moved away from the individual who embodied it. Genghis Khan reversed this dynamic by embedding obedience in procedure rather than presence. Orders traveled along defined channels. Rewards and punishments followed documented behavior. Loyalty attached itself to outcomes, not ancestry. This allowed governance to function across cultures without demanding assimilation. Local customs persisted where they did not interfere with extraction or security. The empire did not seek to convert identities. It sought to regulate behavior. That distinction explains its durability more than any battlefield success. Psychologically, this system altered how ambition expressed itself. Men no longer needed to overthrow rulers to advance. They needed to perform reliably within constraints. Risk shifted from open rebellion to administrative failure. Fear changed shape. It became quieter, internalized, tied to procedure rather than spectacle. This reduced the constant churn of revolt that had characterized earlier empires.